Hi there, everyone. Happy Friday. It's 4 o'clock in New York. So it turns out that the massive $787.5 million settlement in the Dominion Fox News case will not mean the end of the steady drip of damaging revelations involving Fox and those who used Fox to peddle the big lie to try to overturn an election and, by extension, our democracy. Take, for example, this from former Fox News producer turned whistleblower Abby Grossberg. This is Ted Cruz on November 7th, 2020. That's the day President Joe Biden was projected to be the winner by all of the networks of the 2020 election. He was on a phone call with Fox's Maria Bartiromo, stressing the need for proof of any actual election fraud. Listen.
Can't just be, somebody tweeted this. It's got to be demonstrable facts that can be laid out with evidence, because that's what a court of law is going to look to, not just an allegation, but actual facts. And so, I'm hopeful. I hope when Rudy comes on the show tomorrow, he has some of those facts, and I hope the legal team continues to lay out the specific evidence, because that's what it's going to take to prevail in court.
They were all pinning all of their hopes on Rudy and Sidney Powell. It explains why Team Trump would go on to lose 61 times in court, judge after judge after judge, in courts all across the country. Some of those judges appointed by Donald Trump himself, as well as the United States Supreme Court, dismissed Trump's claims of fraud and his attempts to overturn the 2020 election through the courts. And they lost because, as they very well knew, as Ted Cruz knew, there wasn't any evidence of fraud. Recall what former Arizona House Speaker Rusty Bowers testified to before the January 6th Select Committee about a phone call meeting he had with Rudy Giuliani.
At some point, did one of them make a comment that they didn't have evidence, but they had a lot of theories?
That was Mr. Giuliani.
And what exactly did he say, and how did that come up?
My recollection, he said, we've got lots of theories, we just don't have the evidence. And I don't know if that was a gaffe, or maybe he didn't think through what he said, but both myself and others in my group, the three in my group and my council, both remembered that specifically, and afterwards we kind of laughed about it.
I guess it could be funny, but the harm it's done is undeniable, right? There was never any evidence, the lack of, quote, actual facts and specific evidence, as Ted Cruz and Rusty Bowers put it. As Ted Cruz puts it during a phone call on November 7th with Maria Bartiromo. But then it doesn't stop him from working as a senator to overturn the election result. Here he is on January 6th, even though he knows there's no evidence, objecting to the certification of President Joe Biden's Electoral College win. Watch.
I want to speak to the Republicans who are considering voting against these objections. I understand your concerns, but I urge you to pause and think. What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims of illegality and fraud in this election?
What Cruz and what Fox still can't grasp is that half the country believed that because they were lied to by people like Ted Cruz and Fox News. Cruz, unsurprisingly, did not respond to a request for comment from MSNBC, and today there's more. We have more evidence today showing that members of Team Trump, easy for me to say, had their own doubts about whether the people who claim to have the goods about election fraud actually ever had any of the goods about election fraud. In an audio recording that is exclusive to Deadline White House, former Trump administration official Peter Navarro, who played an integral role in peddling election fraud claims, expresses his own doubts about attorney Sidney Powell's claims and her credibility. Here he is talking to Abby Grossberg more than 2 weeks after the January 6th insurrection. Listen.
Sidney Powell, she sends me stuff by mistake. There's an Abby in her office. There's an Abby in her office, and through the whole Flynn trial, she sends me stuff, and then she frantically calls or emails me saying, please delete it, it's confidential.
That horse is out of the barn, right?
So she mistakenly sent me something on Signal on that phone. I'm like, I wonder what that is, but I'm not going to open it because I don't want it to be evidence. And then comes the call 2 minutes later, please delete it. That wasn't intended for you.
Well, you have no idea how much damage she did to our efforts. She really, I'm telling you, Abby, when the history was written on this, she was like the turning point in our inability to prove the case, because she was like so far out there that people like pulled back. We were on the verge of some breakthroughs in the state legislature level, and then that happened, and it was like Katie barred the door. It's like, damn, just not good.
Now, interestingly, in a statement to MSNBC, when he learned we were going to play this tape, Peter Navarro didn't walk away from any of it. In fact, he doubled down on the statements he made about Sidney Powell, saying this, quote, Sidney Powell is basically the worst thing that ever happened to the election integrity issue. As always, I'm being candid with Abby Grossberg, just as I am being candid with the American people. Internal doubts about the veracity of their fraud claims by senior Trump allies about whether there was any evidence of election fraud revealed in new audio recordings is where we start today. Joining us now at the table, Jerry Filipatos. Did I botch that, being a Greek? I feel like I had to nail that.
No, you did it perfectly.
You were the attorney representing Abby in her ongoing lawsuit against Fox News.
Yes.
I think there's some mistake to think that these matters are closed, but they're not at all.
Not at all closed. Abby has two lawsuits, one in Delaware, where she is essentially alleging that there was a civil conspiracy to throw her on the bus, get her to testify falsely, to cover up Fox's misdoings in that case. And that case is ongoing in Delaware. And then she has a case in the Southern District of New York, which is a very unique, even for me, who's been doing this for 30 years, practicing employment discrimination law, a uniquely strong case alleging gender discrimination, glass ceiling discrimination, failure to promote. She didn't get an executive producer spot, although she was a one-woman show along with Maria Bartiromo. And then ultimately was replaced by a man. And then even worse, jumped out of the frying pan into the fire and went to the Tucker Carlson show, where she was subjected to one of the most vile, toxic work environments I've seen in my 30 years of practice.
I've heard some of what, and I've read some of what you and she are alleging, and I want to deal with all of the second, but let's deal with the first one first. Is it a crime to not comply with discovery?
It's not a crime, but it's a serious offense, both for a litigant and for an attorney, probably even more serious for an attorney. And I have to say, I'm shocked at the conduct that went on here. I mean, as I said, been practicing a long time. I don't have to say it. You can just look at my face. But I've prepped a lot of witnesses. I'll give you a confession since we're both Greek. I used to be on the other side and do defense work early in my career. So I've prepped witnesses on both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong as an attorney. I mean, what you're supposed to do is marshal the evidence in favor of your client. You're supposed to, Lego build the wall of either prosecution or defense in order to make your case. That's different from actually denying the evidence, actually affirmatively coaching your client to perjure themselves. The client you're supposed to be protecting as a matter of professional responsibility. And that's what they did to Abby Grossberg. So that's way off the charts. And then to stand up in open court and to actually continue to lie, which I guess, sometimes they say you can see a dog looks like its master. I guess, the Fox attorneys look like Fox. They trade in lies. They just aren't, the truth is unimportant to them. So for them to stand up in court, and after they're excoriated by the judge in Delaware saying to them, you can't say that, as they represented in discovery, that Rupert Murdoch is not somehow in charge of Fox News, and therefore you didn't have to produce all this evidence, which they ultimately had to produce. So the judge yells at them. This is like the Wednesday before the case actually is supposed to go to trial and settles. So he yells at them for like an hour, and then he finishes that. And then one of the attorneys stands up, and they start to deal with the Abby Grossberg's evidence that she presented in that case that was pretty significant. And the Fox attorney says, oh, no. she never told us about those tapes. I mean, we never knew about them at all. And Abby will, swear on the stack of Bible she has already that she told them very clearly that she had those tapes, and she turned them over. And we find, digging through all this stuff without getting into the weeds too much, that they clearly knew, and they clearly held the evidence back because they wanted strategic advantage and broke the rules.
Let's just talk about where the evidence was. So the recordings that got the judge so angry were recordings she made working with Maria on a weekend program. And she sits with the Fox lawyers and tells them about this program where she's recorded pre-interviews.
Right.
People do them all the time. I'm sure my team did one with you.
Right. Yes.
And then she does what? She gives her phones to the lawyers, right? And then what is the normal practice? She's told them about her practice. She's told them where the recordings are, and she's turned over her phone. What should Fox have done?
They should have listened to the recordings and determined whether they were relevant to the outstanding requests for discovery by Dominion. And then they should have produced them, or at the very least, because I think on one of them there was an issue of reporter's privilege, they should have produced them on a privilege log. They didn't say anything about anything until we filed our complaint in the Delaware court and put in I don't want to get into the weeds, but put in a corrected errata sheet. So
her depo gets corrected.
So, because one step back, she gives a deposition after they basically coach her and intimidate her, and they throw her in the... There's like 4 attorneys spent 4 days with her. You never spend 4 days with a witness. Yeah, I mean, it's just ridiculous. Anyway, so she goes in for her deposition, gives her deposition. What's supposed to happen after that is under Delaware law, you're supposed to get a transcript of your deposition so you can read it and make sure it's correct. That you didn't say anything that you didn't mean to say, nothing was mistranscribed, etc. 5.5 months later, only after I start to represent her, and we've asked about, 6, 7 times, does she get her deposition transcript?
Why?
I've said on other shows, I don't spend any time trying to read Fox's mind.
Well, I want to know if you think she's the only person who told Fox's lawyers where there were recordings and potential evidence that they didn't then, when they were handed that Fox employee's phone, go download and turn over to Dominion as part of discovery.
For a fact, I can only talk about Abby's experience. I will tell you that I have had conversations with others close into that litigation, because remember, we weren't technically in that litigation. We had our own case, but at least the pattern of incomplete and obviously coached answers and depositions was not just observed in Abby's deposition.
Let's talk about the workplace. So she works for Maria. That's where some of these recordings are made. But she's at Tucker Carlson most recently. Tell me what that was like for Abby.
I'll just take one step back and explain why she went from Maria to a Tucker show. She had 2.5 years with Maria, and she's often said Maria was an idol for her. She used to watch her on CNBC, and Maria was a trailblazer. I think she was the first woman on the floor of the stock exchange. She was a respected journalist. So when Fox came and heavily recruited Abby, who was at CBS Evening News at the time, she didn't go right away. She had an opportunity for a few other shows, and finally, when the Maria opportunity came up, she went because she thought it would be great. And she quickly found out that it was really Maria and Abby, and these two women in this highly chauvinistic, horrible place. I mean, she was there for 1 week before one of the senior producers said to Abby, Maria, you have to tell us everything she does. She's menopausal. She's crazy, and then afterwards, when they saw the two of them together, after maybe like a year, then a lot of the male executives started to just ignore them and wouldn't give them credit. Like I think Abby told me a story about, she was the first, they were the first to have Trump on after he lost the election. Huge get, right? And in some discussion with one of the senior producers, I think it was David Clark, who's her supervisor, he characterized that as, just silly weekend fluff. So that was the kind of attitude that they were up against. And eventually that led to Abby not being given the executive producer title, although she was the only one working on the show with Maria, and it was the #1 rated show, I think, on the weekends in general, not just Fox. So she figures out, this is not going to work for me. She's also feeling kind of, queasy about Maria's at that point, buy-in into the big lie, and she's trying to push back. Abby is trying to sort of get some informed objectivity in the room.
Does Abby believe Joe Biden won the election?
Oh yeah.
When does she come to believe that?
Well, she started to have suspicions about the big lie probably a week or two in, right?
So she entertains the conspiracy things for about a week, and then she knows.
Right, and then she's doing her job, and she's trying because she's she's the producer.
I get it.
She has to.
But I think Maria still does. So I'm just trying to figure out when.
I mean, we can't read Maria's mind, but that's what it seems like. And Abby feels, I've spoken to her about this a lot. I mean, she said to me, okay, first of all, hypothetically, she said to me, because I can't say anything she told me, because then we would lose all attorney-client privilege. But she might say something to me like, the only thing I have to hide is that I believe that for a week. That's what embarrasses me. I mean, so you get the fact that she's really, at this point, feeling,
like now that she's in your hands, she's your client, she's trying to sort of correct the record. She's worried that might be a vulnerability?
Well, I think she just, it's human nature. You just feel stupid when you do something.
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that.
So,
can you say more about this? You said you were sort of on the defense side before. What does it say to you that a company that really seemed from the outside to have paid a hefty price during the Me Too years? I mean, there are women who were known for coming out and telling the truth about Fox News, and it seems to have absolutely put another senior woman in their newsroom through the wood chipper.
Yeah. I think that it doesn't say a lot for Fox's ability to abide by norms, abide by rules, abide by the law. And it says a lot for its arrogance. I often call it an onion of arrogance. You keep peeling and it just starts to stink more and more. Mm-hmm. And I think that what our greatest worry is that, Fox is not going to change. And at this point, Abby has been put into a position by Fox, throwing her out there, trying to effectively throw her under the bus of the $1.6 billion lawsuit, which she had some senior executive say to her like a couple of months before the trial started to heat up, or before she left, rather. This was, the Dominion lawsuit is all your fault because you didn't put up full screen, which she actually did. And she pointed out to him, no, I did put up the full screen. So at some point she says to herself, well, I have to defend myself. I have to make sure that the truth is known, first of all, about what happened to me, and secondly, about what Fox has done. So we are committed to going through this until the end, until Fox acknowledges its mistakes, acknowledges that it lied about Abby, and that it lied about the election. Is part of that helping Smartmatic make its case against Fox? Well, I would say two things. One, on a moral ground, I was, very heartened to hear Smartmatic's lead attorney, I think yesterday, say that, as far as he's concerned, Smartmatic isn't settling until all the truth comes out. And there is a public acknowledgement by Fox that they misrepresented the facts, right? And we want that, and we want that regarding Abby as well. And we won't rest until that happens. As technically speaking, I think that Abby's civil conspiracy case that's in Delaware is really the sinew between the Dominion case and the Smartmatic case, because a lot of the common players are involved that she has certain evidence about. And one thing to say about Abby is that she keeps the receipts, so there's a lot of evidence. And it's my understanding that she investigated her own case. So in terms of being able to surprise her, the two of you have the facts and the research and have done the discovery that Fox didn't do. Is that accurate? It's fair to say. What is your sense in terms of what she possesses that we in the public haven't seen? How damaging is that to Fox? I mean, do you think she was a factor in Fox deciding to settle? Again, I can't read Fox's mind. Don't even try. But look at the facts, right? I mean, in my business, you put cases together through circumstantial evidence most of the time, especially in discrimination cases. Typically you don't have a smoking gun when an employer says, "Oh, I'm firing you because of your age, your gender, your race, etc." So you have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And if you have a case that hasn't settled, and really, every lawyer says that, when you settle a case on the courthouse steps, you've really failed your client on both sides, right? Because you shouldn't have to go through all of that pain. And especially in this case, from Fox's perspective, to have all that stuff come out and to have, to be on the eve of having your chairman on the stand. So it should have been settled much earlier, but it wasn't. And maybe part of that was Smartmatic holding the line, but I'm sure if Smartmatic was, took $787 million last week, they probably would have taken it 3 months ago, right? So I think that there was something happened. And the one thing that I can think that happened is that Abby came forth with a lot of evidence that they're still trying to suppress. They just filed another motion. They've now lost, I think, 3 motions trying to gag Abby, and they've just filed a 4th or at least a letter in Delaware.
And you said to my colleague Ari that law enforcement has been in touch about the recordings. What can you say about that?
I can only say that we're in communication with numerous law enforcement agencies about the tapes that we've made public, and we've informed these law enforcement agencies that there are more tapes. We're sifting through upwards of 90 tapes.
Are you concerned about, I think about women like Cassidy Hutchinson and Gretchen Carlson and others who have sort of taken a stand against either Fox specifically or this Trumpy wing of the party. I think about the witness tampering that took place with Cassidy Hutchinson. Are you worried about her as a person?
Well, I worry about my clients all the time, and I worry especially about a high-profile client. But, some lawyers say you're only as good as your client, and, I'm blessed to have a wonderful client. She's amazingly courageous, resilient, educated, and smart. And she has photographic memory. She knows the case better than I do, and I spend a lot of time studying the case.
Has she heard from Maria Bartiromo?
I haven't had that discussion with her. Probably, within the last 6 months or so, I think at some point. But they left, I'll say this, I haven't heard anything that they've had any kind of acrimonious exchange.
How about Tucker Carlson?
No. I don't think she never had much of a, communication with Tucker Carlson. It's funny, you said you wanted some of the, sort of the Hollywood behind the scenes stuff, right?
Sure.
So when Abby testified at her deposition, remember they're hammering her to get her to say exactly this or that, and they had shown her an email or text, I'm not sure which, where Tucker Carlson used some vile misogynistic language. And this was as she was transitioning. That's another key piece of the story. The deposition prep and actual deposition happened as she was going from Maria Bartiromo to Tucker Carlson. So they, in deposition prep, they show her this email and they say, Dominion's attorneys might show you something like this and say, are you offended by it, right? And C word, all sorts of horrible stuff.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. And which, by the way, was bandied about like hello, apparently in the newsroom there.
In the shocking but not surprising category.
Right. So they prep her and they get her to say, well, I didn't really didn't happen while I was there. I'm just starting there now. I can't say, right? Which, of course, was not truthful. She didn't feel truthful to her. And we corrected it in the errata sheet, right? So after the deposition, this comes out somehow. And to the David Clark and others. So they have an Abby Day where they get bagels and coffee to congratulate her for, sticking up for Tucker and making sure that he didn't get into trouble.
Oh my God. I can't. Yeah. Wow. Let me just do this in the spirit of housekeeping and fairness. This is Fox's statement on Abby to the New York Times. Quote, "We will continue to vigorously defend Fox against Ms. Grossberg's unmeritorious legal claims, which are riddled with false allegations against Fox and our employees," a Fox News spokeswoman said. We'll see if the bagel breakfast is among what they're claiming to have been false. Let me ask you one last question.
Can I respond to that first? So where's the camera?
Your camera's right here.
So I'd like to speak to Fox's attorneys, and I've said this in letters before, so I'll just do it on TV.
Sure.
I challenge you to debate me, I'll go on Fox Air with any of you, all of you, and you can show me one place, just one, in any of our public pleadings where we have said a falsehood. I can show you probably 50 in yours.
Well, there you have it. A challenge to, I think Ari Melber would be better suited to moderate, so I'm going to stay out of this one. But I appreciate
Sorry, I really wanted to do that because they've really upset me. You
are clearly committed to your client and to helping us as the public understand what's gone on behind the scenes at Fox News, not just related to the Dominion case, but to Abby's cases. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. When we come back, there are new details from Jim Rutenberg at the New York Times on what was the absolute non-starter for Dominion, the no-go zone, and what the Fox News hardline was in those final negotiations, as well as how Rupert Murdoch himself factored into all of it. Plus, a nation armed to the hilt with guns, along with more self-defense laws empowering Americans. We'll take another look at how both of those things, combined with small missteps that everybody makes in their own lives, are yielding deadly new consequences. And later in the broadcast, the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in by midnight tonight on whether a pill used by millions of American women for miscarriage, healthcare, and abortions should remain available and legal. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. This is Nicolle Wallace from MSNBC. Donald Trump became the first ex-president to be arraigned on criminal charges, pleading not guilty to 34 felonies. On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, legal analysts and veteran prosecutors Andrew Weissman and Mary McCord break down how Alvin Bragg, Fani Willis, and Jack Smith might think about building a case when the defendant happens to be an ex-president. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening and follow. There's some incredible brand new reporting today on just how that massive $787.5 million settlement came together. The New York Times reports that at first both sides were determined and set to go to trial. From that reporting, quote, one of Dominion's biggest asks was a non-starter for Fox. That's a public apology from the network for its role in implicating Dominion in a fictitious, algorithmically driven scheme to steal the 2020 election from Donald Trump. Fox's insistence on no admission of wrongdoing at all was a non-starter for Dominion. The two companies, whose lawyers had exchanged dollar amounts over the weekend, were also far apart on a settlement number. But their positions began to soften as they barreled toward trial. Once again, for the New York Times, over the weekend, Lachlan Murdoch, intent on finding a way to a deal, had given his team the go-ahead to raise the dollar amount the company would pay. And during those talks, as the Fox offer increased, Dominion softened its bottom line about an admission of wrongdoing. The compromise, an acknowledgement from Fox that it understood Judge Davis's pretrial rulings against the network, including that the defamatory Dominion conspiracies Fox had aired were objectively false. Joining our conversation, New York Times writer at large, Jim Rutenberg. His reporting is what we've just been reading from. And MSNBC host, legal analyst Katie Phang, who's talked us through this entire trial that wasn't all week long. She was in the courtroom at the start of what was supposed to be day one. Jim, take me through your reporting. It's fascinating.
Thanks. Well, great to be here, back from Delaware. So
quick trip.
Really, this quicker trip than we expected. Not that quick. But I will say there was so much drama, as Katie knows. We were sitting in that courtroom as opening arguments were going to start. But what we didn't know was just how much frenzied action there was behind the scenes. And as we reported, but this was new to us yesterday, is that Lachlan Murdoch, the leader of the company, the son of Rupert, had given the go-ahead to lawyers over the weekend, give a higher number. And the higher number was critical. However, it still isn't even until the jury is impaneled that they get into the negotiation where the number comes high enough to have Dominion soften on what it expected in terms of an apology, as we understand it. But we also understand that the wrangling is going through about what Fox will say after this, what everyone can say after this. It goes on through the end. And as you know, the statement that comes out really let down a lot of Fox critics. But as far as Dominion's attorneys saw it, as they said afterward, the number spoke for itself, and at least they got Fox to admit that there were some judicial rulings that found before the trial that the Dominion conspiracies that were issue here were false and kind of defamatory per se, So Fox was at least acknowledging that these rulings happened. And in fact, they would have almost certainly quibbled or disputed those rulings had they gone through an appeal process.
What is amazing to me is if you engineer it the other way, this was a $700 or an $800 million lie. I mean, if you take it the other way, at the end of the day, this was how much was Fox willing to pay to never tell their viewers the truth, Katie?
Well, yeah. And, to Jim's point there, it kind of reminds me of a duck, kind of a very poker face, chill on top of the water. And then the feet are furiously going, underneath the water and you don't see what's going on. But if you were to watch the dynamics within the courtroom, you would have seen, Nicolle, that they were inching their way towards a settlement. One, there's no way that Judge Davis was going to allow a jury to sit for an hour and a half, 2 hours without any action going on. But two, most importantly, people need to understand for a deal this big to happen, the negotiations were constantly taking place. This is not something that you scribble on the back of a napkin and say, here's the deal. The actual deal terms were already being hammered out. But I said this 2 days ago, 3 days ago. Now it's all a blur. I say it again. It's not until you see the whites of their eyes, and their eyes being the jury. When you have a jury sworn in a panel, that is when it gets real. And that is when exactly you need to find and have that gut check as to what you're willing to put on the line. And for Fox, it wasn't just stroking the check to be able to get this done. It was not adding to the increased exposure to the company in terms of its brand, its reputational kind of quality of what it was putting out. And I say that in quotes, right? Because what is the quality there? But I wanted to kind of touch very quickly, Nicolle, on something that Abby Grossberg's lawyer just said, which I found to be incredibly compelling. It's this idea about integrity and honesty when it comes to you as a lawyer. What I'm disappointed the most about from this, putting aside the lack of having a public on-air retraction and acknowledgement of what it said were lies, is the fact that that special master order that was entered on Tuesday morning, basically saying, Fox, you did exceptionally bad misconduct, and I'm putting a special master in place to hunt down how bad that was. I think that actually hurts the judicial system more so than not having Fox come out and actually say that they lied. Because the through line before the November 2020 election to the date of the election, November and December of 2020, January 6, 2021, up until this week alone where the lies are still being perpetrated on Fox, the through line are lies. And if you don't hold the people that actually are the megaphone for those lies, from the hosts and the anchors to the lawyers themselves, responsible and accountable, then where do you actually find accountability? Which is why the Smartmatic lawsuit, Abby Grossberg's lawsuits, the shareholder derivatives lawsuits, I'm harping on those, Nicolle, because those are still going to be knocking at Fox's door saying, pay up or shut up, right? And we're going to see what's going to happen.
Well, I mean, speaking of paying up, I mean, Jim Rutenberg, what I sort of wrote down 3 different places on my notes was 90. Abby Grossberg has 90 recordings. I think we've heard 3. How much of this was about not what? The other thing, and this is so sort of behind the curtain, but our viewers have sort of lived through 7 years of covering Trump and Fox, and so I want to have this conversation. Otter is a program that people use when they're doing a lot of interviewing. I don't know if either of you use it in your work, but she says to her lawyers, we did our pre-interviews on Otter. And then she takes her phone and she says, go get it. They do nothing. I mean, and again, I don't know the pre-interview practices of other EPs at the network or if other people recorded things. But I think this looming question of discovery that wasn't, I guess I'll just, to Katie's point, I always wonder how much that played into the settlement, Jim.
Look, I do not have reporting that specifically says that played into the settlement. However, it's kind of part of a stew that did play into the settlement, which was that Fox, ahead of trial, kept getting crosswise. Their lawyers kept getting crosswise with the judge. What a horrible way to go into what was already going to be a really tough case. So no matter what, just the optics of all of this, and that was a big part of the pre-trial optics, were in this mix. So you could see Lachlan Murdoch already not wanting to take the stand himself, not wanting to see his father grilled, not wanting to see his host grilled, a judge who's going to be predisposed to kind of rule against them on whatever objections could be happening during that questioning. You'd see it all as a reason to say to the lawyers, move up that number. Let's find a way out of this.
Now, moving up the number is exactly what Smartmatic is doing at this point. Katie, let me play this. This is a Smartmatic attorney, Eric Connolly.
Do you have a number in mind that you would settle for? You know what Fox just settled Dominion for. Will you settle for that number or anything less?
I think the way I would answer that is my client looks at that and will say that that is a good start for where the settlement numbers go, and they need to go up from there. There's a big difference between Dominion and Smartmatic. Dominion's a great company. They're focused in North America. Smartmatic is a global company. Smartmatic is the only company that actually operates globally in this industry. And so when you're talking about the damages that the companies are experiencing, my client suffered global reputational harm. 5 continents they've done business on, and they've suffered reputational harm in all 5 of those. So you're going to need to see a very significant number to come even close to making my client whole because of that.
So, Katie, I try to have a little bit of skepticism of television negotiations, but this idea of the sort of the size and scale of the company, the damages it suffered, you add that to this contaminated discovery process, as the judge found in the Dominion case. And I wonder where you put, at this early stage, Smartmatic's legal strategy moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be honest. There's posturing, right? And there's a little bit of posturing that happens on the public court of opinion as well as when it happens in the courtroom. I will say Smartmatic is actually procedurally at a very good stage. It survived an appellate review by certain motions to dismiss that were filed by Fox, and there are certain defendants that remain inside this litigation. Smartmatic, interestingly, is taking the position that its damages model, as you heard from Eric Connolly, the lawyer, is global reputational harm. In this instance, Fox has actually responded, and of course I can't quote it verbatim, but I will say this, Nicolle. Fox's response to Smartmatic's posturing has been their damages model is flawed. Note that Fox doesn't say we didn't do anything wrong. Note that Fox doesn't say that Smartmatic is wrong from a liability standpoint. It's just, quote, the damages model is wrong. But let's speak frankly, because it does speak to the Dominion lawsuit, Nicolle. A lot of people are so upset about the fact that there wasn't a cross the finish line, go to a jury verdict, condemnation of Fox News in the Dominion trial. But Eric Connolly is the lawyer representing a business. This is a commercial decision to be made. I don't know how much money Fox is willing to put on the table to be able to make Smartmatic's lawsuit go away. I suspect you're going to see a lot of the same machinations in the courtroom. But Smartmatic is claiming $2.7 billion. Let's see if they come close.
Amazing. Thank you to both of you for getting us through the last. I know it was a short Delaware spurt, but there was a lot of expertise you shared in all the days and weeks leading up to it. Thank you to both of you, Jim Rutenberg and Katie Phang. Be sure to catch Katie's show, The Katie Phang Show, tomorrow and Sunday and every weekend morning at 8 a.m. right here on MSNBC. A very short break for us, and then there's new evidence today about guns. And as they become more and more available, more commonplace, how everything we do in our normal lives becomes a risky undertaking. We'll explain.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Llamas from Top Story on NBC News Now. Every night, Top Story is your news playlist. We take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. And now, Top Story is available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime and anywhere. Subscribe now for new episodes every weeknight.
Think about this. 1 in 5 American households purchased a firearm during the COVID pandemic. About 60 million guns are enough to arm every man, woman, and child in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Virginia, Arizona, Tennessee, and New Mexico combined, just between the years 2020 and 2022. That is a rate about twice what it was 15 to 20 years ago. And of note, during the pandemic, according to data from the nonprofit Trace, 15 million Americans bought a firearm for the very first time. As if we needed any statistics at all, though, to tell us what's happening. The United States is a powder keg flush with deadly new weapons. There are school shootings. There are mass school shootings. There are shootings happening at grocery stores, parties, churches, dance halls. They happen about once a week. 88 lives in 111 days. And then there are the accidental shootings. We don't pay quite as much attention to those, but we probably should. Like the heartbreaking ones we have covered on this program every day this week. So that third category is the subject of some impressive new reporting in the New York Times today that makes the connection between the ongoing domestic arms race, that's what we have here, and the everyone's out to get you mindset cultivated and permeated by the far right. Quote, each one of these incidents resulted from unique events, but activists and researchers say they stem from a convergence of bigger factors: increased fear of crime and an attendant surge in gun ownership, increasingly extreme political messaging on firearms, fear-mongering in the media, and marketing campaigns by the gun industry that portray the suburban front door as a fortified barrier against a violent world. Joining us now, political strategist and MSNBC contributor Matt Dowd, and the Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, as well as the president of the National Action Network. Matt Dowd, you sort of live there in Texas, in sort of the real world, where red America and blue America can sometimes clash violently. And maybe this arming of America that took place during the pandemic was less of a shock to you, but just the numbers of guns that are out there and the level of rage and fear of our neighbors just feels like something we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. What do we do now?
Well, I'm glad we're having this conversation because, we know we've talked about guns and the trauma that it causes and all of that, and I'm glad the Reverend's here with this because I think this is much more of a spiritual crisis that we're in, that it's revealed in us, in our country. And you've talked about this before, but what's happening? All of this is happening. Guns are being bought. There's 400 million guns in the country, 330 million people in the country, more guns than people in our country. But what's happening is Americans are becoming simultaneously more fearful and more isolated. And that combination of more fearful and more isolated feeds into this. And so it used to be red state, blue state. OK, we're going to deal with that. And then we say we're going to take care of our neighborhoods and our communities of interest. Well, now by what's happening is because people have become more isolated and they now are driven in large part by the reptile part of their brain, their fear part of their brain, it's now created an opportunity where not only are you afraid to knock on somebody's door, whether it's a vote or something, you're now like, can I even tend to my neighbor if they're in need? Can I even go next door if their tree has fallen down and knock on their door and seek to help? And that, and I know I'm going to phrase something Joe Biden talks about, the soul of America. When we no longer have those bonds of community and bonds that bind us together, then our democracy really is in fundamental peril. If we now are in fear of our neighbors, because they own guns or we think they might own guns, and then we simultaneously become more isolated, that is a recipe for a huge problem. And I will point out in the history of our country, when we have gotten to those places, usually the result of those places is very, very bad policies and certain groups of people being victimized. The internments of Japanese before World War I was a combination of fear and isolation. The Espionage Act before World War I was a result of fear, and that the Indian Removal Act was a result of fear and all of that. And all of those things are a result of when fear combines with isolation, bad things happen.
Rev, Margay made the important point that if you grow up black in America, you have had this fear of being shot by accident or on purpose for your whole life. And that some of the coverage even of the last week is that in some ways anyone who gets into the wrong car or opens up the door to the wrong Uber or knocks on the wrong door or pulls into the wrong driveway may be experiencing something that a lot of communities have lived with for a long time.
That a lot of communities have lived with for our entire lives. And I think that is not to say that, oh, now you understand what I'm saying, ha, ha, ha. That's saying we need to do something about it, because I agree with Matthew Dowd's assessment. It is going to be the breakdown of society and then start scapegoating segments of people to try and relieve that kind of fear. At the same time, what embellishes this isolation is bad law. These stand your ground laws. Let's not lose the sight of the fact that the 16-year-old black kid shot in Kansas City by an 84-year-old white man whose grandson is saying that his grandfather was bigoted. he's going to use stand your ground laws as a defense, and so will the others. And we must be just as outraged when a black guy does it against a white girl in one of these 3 incidents this week, and he will probably use stand your ground. To shoot at some girls in a car, cheerleaders, and to shoot at some that just moved up, drove into a driveway. Every community must denounce this equally, as I would denounce the apparent racial shooting in Kansas City, because even the head of the police there said the prosecutor said it was racial overtones. So I think we need to really deal with law. We need to deal with environment in terms of what we are setting as the culture. And I agree with Matthew. There's a spiritual element to this because we're dealing with all of our own fears becoming realized with a gun in our hand.
I want to press both of you on what it means that it's not safe to ring a doorbell in America anymore for people that go door to door for a job, or people that go door to door on elections or March a Dime. Or I really want some today advice from both of you. I have to sneak in a quick break. The Rev and Matt and I'll be back on the other side. So my question for both of you. We've all worked on and been around and run for office. If you are running for office, do you do anything differently, knowing that ringing a bell could expose you to being shot or to violence or to some hostility, Matt?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because you have to be obviously provide for the safety of anybody that works for you. And if that's impugned or impacted by the fact that somebody may own a gun in that, obviously you have to be cognizant. The problem is, I think the problem is that if we stay isolated, they win. The forces of hate and division win. The more we sit in fear and the more we sit in isolation, they win. And with everything that is broken down in our society and that technology that's provided, it is so easy to stay isolated. And if we can't stand in front of another human being and see them for who they are, then the forces of hate and division win.
I know that's the right answer, Rev, but if you're running a campaign and you've got volunteers willing to go door to door for you, do you send them?
It's a very, very serious dilemma. I mean, right now we're involved in a lot of civil rights campaigns. Just finished National Action Network's convention. We don't want to send people door to door because you just don't know. I think that influencers must start talking about the real downward slope we're in terms of feeling safe in the country. And we must do things about laws like Stand Your Ground that emboldens people to shoot first and ask questions later, because they feel there's no liability in terms of criminal law that they will face.
Let me tell you what I think. I think this is one of the most bat bleep crazy twists that our country has taken. I've got an 11-year-old. I wouldn't let him ring anyone's doorbell anywhere. The notion that someone behind the door could be raging away, with some right-wing propaganda about some zombie crime wave and come to the door with a gun terrifies me. And if people don't think that there's a sort of silent majority out there that doesn't want to live in fear of their kids ringing a doorbell, we're all watching. It's nuts. Matt Dowd, Rev Al Sharpton, thank you very much. To be continued. We're also getting closer to that Supreme Court self-imposed midnight deadline. We'll talk about what we can expect on that ruling on mifepristone after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
This case should have never even been heard. I mean, this was so extreme that one judge in Amarillo, Texas, decided he had the power to rescind the FDA approval of a drug that's been approved for decades, and that the ability of women everywhere to access this medicine, not only for abortion care, but also for miscarriage management, is literally at risk.
Hi again, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. The United States Supreme Court has until midnight tonight to weigh in on a case that you just heard from our friend Cecile Richards, the former president of Planned Parenthood, never should have been heard in the first place. One that, if upheld, would have dire and immediate consequences for every woman and every family, frankly, in the country. The court's decision could come at any minute. It is the case we've been watching closely for weeks now, whether a commonly used miscarriage management and abortion pill called mifepristone will remain accessible to women across the country. The highest court in the land is considering a recent decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which would roll back access to pre-2016 levels when the usage of the pill was expanded. Now, the expansions that it underwent allowed it to be used through 10 weeks of pregnancy rather than 7, and allowed it to be sent in the mail, which is more important now than ever. New York Times reports this, quote, experts say removing the mail option would have significant consequences. Patients would have to take time off work, pay travel costs to get to a medical office, and endure the stigma of going out in public to seek an abortion. Mifepristone is widely used in the country. More than half of abortions in the U.S. are now done with a 2-step medication regimen, of which mifepristone is part of it, one of the 2 steps. In addition to abortion medication access, also in jeopardy with the Supreme Court's decision is the overall authority of an agency, of the FDA. The president of the American Medical Association, the AMA, Jack Resnick Jr., said that this ruling could be one of the most brazen attacks on Americans' health yet. He writes that if mifepristone's approval is questioned, other FDA-approved drugs could also come under scrutiny. Bear with me, it's a long list. Quote, after 3 years of politicization fueled by disinformation, this would surely include challenges to many vaccines, including those that reduce the risks of serious illness from COVID-19. We should expect lawsuits against common types of safe and highly effective hormonal birth control, including emergency contraception. Also at risk, drugs used to treat cancer and arthritis that can incidentally affect unexpected pregnancies, drugs to prevent or treat HIV, and medications aimed at providing gender-affirming care. The threat may ultimately include promising drugs and treatments built around stem cell technology to treat Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, or even more common types of chronic disease such as diabetes. He sums it up this way, quote, we simply cannot be a country where your access to the care you need is determined by the whims of ideologically driven judges and lawmakers without medical or scientific training. Awaiting the United States Supreme Court's extremely consequential decision is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Dahlia Lithwick is here. She's the senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate, also the host of the Amicus podcast. Also joining us, former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid, now professor at the University of Michigan Law School. Both Dahlia and Barbara are MSNBC legal analysts. And with me at the table, Dr. Lippy Roy, medical director of Housing Works. Dahlia, I'm not going to cover this story as though it happens, in a 3-ring circus over here, while the crisis for the Supreme Court happens over here. They're one and the same. Part of the reason the Supreme Court has historic low approval ratings is the story we talk about a lot, the ethics crisis that it is facing, in large part due to Clarence Thomas, and we'll talk about that. There's an update on that story. But a lot of it is being so out of the mainstream of American thought. 85% of all Americans, according to Gallup, think abortion should be legal in certain or any circumstances. We're at an 85% issue, and the United States Supreme Court has put itself with the 13%.
I mean, you made this point in your opening, and I think it's kind of really essential to understand that the fundamental promise/lie of the Dobbs decision was that this was going to go, A, to the political branches, and B, to the states, that the court was getting itself out of the abortion administration business. And yet here we are less than a year after Dobbs, and we've got a nationwide injunction from one judge in Texas who sees fit to make a determination for the entire country. And it will fundamentally change the right of states to govern themselves. So everything that we were promised in Dobbs, everything that Justice Kavanaugh told us in Dobbs about kicking this back to the people, and don't forget Justice Alito, and Dobbs said, women are not without political power, work this out at the polls. All of that was not true. And I think the important thing that you're saying, and I think we have to really center this in the conversation, is not just that the court is on the side of the tiny minority that thinks this is okay, but that the court is in the business of making it harder and harder for people to do what they want at the polls. And so when the court tells us, sort this out by yourselves with elections, and then snatches back the power to determine this themselves, we understand that this isn't just an abortion problem, this is a court problem.
Well, and then when you making it impossible to receive the health care you need isn't a bug, it is the feature, right? That is the point. And when you look at eliminating the option of having medication mailed to you, Slate has this great reporting. If the Supreme Court agrees, providers will no longer be able to mail abortion pills to patients. But the long-term implications are even more dire. The Comstock Act's overbroad language could effectively outlaw medication abortion by making it illegal to transport to clinics, to pharmacies, or to patients. President Joe Biden presumably won't enforce the ban, but the next Republican president probably would, threatening violators with years of incarceration. We've also reported on some great local stories of OBGYNs making plans of what to do with their kids in terms of custody if they go to prison for doing their jobs. What are we sort of living through in your view, Barbara?
It's a really strange time. And, the Comstock Act is one of these things. It's a very old law that made it a crime to send obscene materials through the mail. So extending that to medication used for abortion is itself quite a stretch, certainly not something that was contemplated at the time that law was put on the books. And so that argument is a stretch. There are two other arguments in this case that it really should make any lawyer's head explode, regardless of what you feel about abortion law. This is just a farce. Number one is standing. Before a case should be heard, there should be a real matter in interest, a real harm, an articulable harm. These doctors have a very theoretical harm that someday, if someone uses this medication and somehow it goes wrong and somehow they end up at their hospital and somehow they're the doctor that has to help complete this abortion, their rights will be violated. That's the speculative harm here. That alone should be enough to dismiss this case. But then the other one is that a judge could overrule a decision by the FDA that a drug should be on the market. This drug has been on the market for 23 years, and if this case is allowed to stand, then no drug on the market is safe. And pharmaceutical companies will not have the kind of assurances they need to invest research and development in the manufacture of drugs. So if this were any other issue besides abortion, the Supreme Court would quickly and summarily throw this case out its door. And the only reason they're taking all this time is because it's such a hot button cultural issue. If we just look at this on the law, this case should not even be in court.
I have a follow-up question for you that's legal in nature. But Barbara McQuaid, I have to confess that I appropriated the Comstock Act, which I asked you about, with former Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock's name. And you didn't even blink, flinch. You just jumped right in and answered it. My legal follow-up question, though, is why isn't there anyone... I mean, is it surprising to you that the block of six won't crack on this almost, unprecedented activism, exclusive treatment for abortion rulings that, to your point, are so legally unsound?
Yeah, I don't know. And I wonder if that's not the reason that we had this delay. Remember, they originally said they were going to get an answer to this question on Wednesday night. They extended their deadline to Friday night. That suggests to me that there is some disagreement going on within the court. I don't know if it's within the block of six or if there's someone else who's planning to dissent. This really should be a no-brainer. They should either just grant the stay or dismiss the case altogether. And the fact that time is going by suggests to me that there is some difference of opinion there. I guess we'll see soon enough what it is.
So, Dr. Lippi-Roy, I don't like to go much longer than this without talking about the real consequences for women. Take us through what they are.
So let me be explicit, Nicolle. Abortion care is health care. Reproductive health, and more broadly speaking, women's health, is being politicized, and that needs to stop. Decisions are being made by judges, elected officials, about medications like mifepristone, which was approved by the FDA over 20 years ago. This is a medication that has been used safely by over 5 million women in the United States to safely terminate pregnancies. The fact that, again, these judges and elected officials, people with zero medical training, are making these decisions, including the removal of the approval of these FDA medications, is, to me and many of my medical colleagues, shocking. It's reckless, and it's medically reprehensible. As a doctor and as a woman of color, of South Asian Indian descent, who has had the privilege of taking care of so many marginalized and underserved women who will be disproportionately impacted by this ruling, it's it makes me livid, to be really honest. This is going to impact so many people. And, the Association of American Medical Colleges, or the AMC, released a report showing that the states that have banned abortion, they are seeing a 10% reduction in OB-GYN resident applications.
Yeah, I saw that headline. So what does that mean? I mean, that means that all reproductive health care becomes less accessible for women everywhere.
In this segment that you're having with the guests you've already said, you've already displayed several repercussions, right? So one of the many repercussions will be that if there are fewer people, we're talking about, let me unpack this. We're talking about young women and men who've completed medical school. They've gone into medicine because it's a calling, just like it was for me. And they've chosen to go, or they wanted to go into this profession of obstetrics and gynecology. But now, given these rulings and restrictions on the work that they'll be able to do and the services that they'll be able to provide, they're declining not to do that. And just so your viewers know, obstetrics and gynecology includes miscarriages. It includes cervical cancer, endometrial cancer, endometriosis. These are all medical health conditions, medical and surgical, that women to this day, every single day, experience. And because there's going to be fewer people going into this field, it's going to create OB-GYN or maternal health deserts, which will again impact people in rural communities and people of color. This has to stop. It's reprehensible.
I mean, Dahlia, I guess the tragic sort of collision between what the science says and what our hyper-politicized and ideological Supreme Court is expected to do, they could always surprise us. I'm open to that. I would be thrilled if that happened, is that they don't care. I mean, they are so far, it would appear, immune from either public sentiment or the preservation of any sort of doctor-patient relationship. But annihilating the FDA seems like a really new low, even for this version of the Supreme Court. What's your thought on that?
Nicolle, I have long passed the day when I say to you, I think this is the thing that's going to make the justices breaks. I've given up, I think, about a year ago saying this to you, because time and time again, any one of the things that the court is nominally on the hook for, whether it's Clarence Thomas's ethics revelations, whether it's being so far out ahead of its skis on so many issues, the public approval, it doesn't seem to bother them. And I think I just want to say this, just in light of what Dr. Roy just said. If you are an OBGYN in this country trying to figure out in the next 7 hours what the state of the law is, you've got a patient with a miscarriage, you've got a patient with a non-viable pregnancy, and you are trying literally to figure out not just what the state of the law is, but the state of medicine. This is not the way we do things. And I'm mindful of what Matt Dowd said in your earlier segment about the sort of sense that everyone is a law unto themselves, and that the court, in the face of that kind of chaos, seems not to be bothered at all.
Do you want to address that? I mean, what should doctors do who don't know what to do with a patient in crisis today?
Yeah, so Dahlia hit the nail on the head. I mean, doctors have to manage so much. By the way, it's a whole medical team. It's doctors, it's nurses, it's all these other specialists that are taking care of this individual patient. They already have to know so much information about that medical and surgical condition, and now to have to understand the ever-changing, ever-evolving rules and laws that are archaic. And to be honest, this is not just about abortion. This is really about oppression of women and their ability to have bodily autonomy. I don't know. I just don't know how doctors are going to be able to keep track and then face legal and criminal ramifications. This is not why people went into this profession, Nicolle. And you're seeing the repercussions of this, because not only are there fewer people going into OB-GYN residencies, but emergency medicine as well.
Right,
and
you could end up in the emergency room too.
A lot of obstetric complications happen in the emergency department. So this is going to have widespread repercussions.
So it took me until the end of the last hour to say it's insanity. I'm at 16 minutes and it's already insanity to me. I want to come back to the ethics of the Supreme Court, because as I said to you, Dahlia, they're not separate from this crisis of credibility that the court has. This is NBC's latest reporting that Senator Durbin has asked Chief Justice John Roberts to testify about the Supreme Court ethics rules. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin has asked Chief Justice John Roberts on Thursday to testify before Congress in early May about ethics rules for Supreme Court justices and potential reforms. Durbin said in a letter that Roberts last addressed ethical issues at the High Court In a 2011 report, since then, he said, quote, there has been a steady stream of revelations regarding justices falling short of the ethical standards expected of other federal judges and indeed of public servants generally. Barbara, I may age myself here, but 2011 was a very long time ago. It was another time and place. And it was actually a time when the Supreme Court was at least 20 points more popular than it is today.
Yeah, you know, the Supreme Court makes the argument that their justices should be shielded from the same laws that apply to other judges because they're created by the Constitution, not by statute like the other courts, and therefore it would be a separation of powers problem to have them subject to ethics rules. But I think that argument really just falls flat when you have members of the executive branch who have to abide by ethics rules. You have members of the legislative branch that have to abide by ethical rules. I don't see how it in any way diminishes the power of a separate but co-equal branch of government to simply have to comply with those ethics rules. When I worked in government, I'm sure you saw this too, I could not take free stuff because it might compromise me. It might create the appearance of compromising me. You had to say no to everything. You couldn't have, free meals. You couldn't go to banquets. You couldn't get, most certainly you couldn't go on a super yacht to trips to New Zealand and Indonesia. And then also you are subject to financial disclosure forms. Show us all of your sources of income from everything, every gift that you've received. All of it has to be disclosed. And so the idea that the Supreme Court is somehow above that really, I think, is what is contributing. They have some other problems, but it's certainly contributing to this loss of legitimacy. And if John Roberts cares about the institution of the court, here is a way to immediately make things better.
I think that's so important. Here is a way to immediately make things better. Dahlia, will he?
I mean, I think at some point he will probably, after the end of this term, agree to come testify. But I just want to be really clear that while it's been years since he's talked about ethics, he devoted his State of the Judiciary speech on New Year's to one topic, which is threats against judges and justices. So in his view and in the view of the other justices, and I know you've talked about Justice Alito suggesting that the Dobbs leak opened the justices up for attacks on their very lives. I think they continue to look at this quote unquote scandal and this drop in popularity and all of the attendant drama around it as fundamentally a question about attacks on them. And that's how they frame it. That's how they see it. And I don't think that they are in any way susceptible to the notion that people are going to suffer. They will be immiserated. People will ultimately die and be incarcerated as a consequence of a decision they are pondering now. And yet in their telling of the story, the real victims every time are them.
Dahlia, how did they get so detached and distant from the American public?
I mean, I think in some sense they've always been detached and distant by design. That's the nature of life tenure. That's the nature of building a structure 100 years ago that looks like a Greek oracular temple, right? It's by design that they're supposed to not be subject to the whims and pressures of the American public. And so in some sense, we built it that way. But I think that this court is singular, at least in my lifetime and my reporting, not only in being sort of unbothered by the disdain that the public feels by the lack of confidence, but by this utterly circular notion that the folks to blame for that are either the press or the public. What's weird to me is this almost complete inability, at least from some of the justices, to take a hard look in the mirror and say, you know, again, this goes to Barb's point. If we wanted some of this to stop, we could stop going on yachts. This is not difficult. And the decision to say that's our fault, that's the fault of the press or whoever reported it, that's the fault of the people who are banging on about ethics. What's weird is not just that they're immunized, but they really think they're not immunized enough.
It's insane. Richard Painter was the ethics lawyer for the Bush White House when I worked in politics. We could not, when I say we could not drink a diet soda that was purchased by a reporter or anyone else, I am not exaggerating. Dahlia Lithwick, Barbara McQuade, Dr. Lippy Roy, thank you so much for starting us off this hour. When we come back, the secret Republican donor retreat, where longtime GOP lawyer and big lie promoter Cleta Mitchell said the quiet part out loud. Do whatever it takes to make it more difficult to vote. Their strategy is clear heading into the next election, 2024, suppress the votes of people who don't vote for Republicans. Top Democratic election attorney Mark Elias will be our next guest. Plus, a massive walkout by Florida high school students angry at what they're calling an authoritarian takeover of public schools, just days after Governor Ron DeSantis's Don't Say Gay law was extended through 12th grade. And later in the broadcast, some hopeful news to tell you about. Voters are rejecting the right-wing extremism in local school board elections so far this year. Far-right candidates are losing, and losing badly. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Llamas from Top Story on NBC News Now. Every night, Top Story is your news playlist. We take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. And now, Top Story is available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime and anywhere. Subscribe now for new episodes every weeknight.
Brand new reporting in the Washington Post takes us inside the room where big money donors were urged to restrict voting unapologetically and undemocratically ahead of the 2024 election. In an exclusive new report, the Post obtained a copy of a slideshow ahead of last weekend's RNC donor retreat, a presentation that was prepared for longtime GOP lawyer Cleta Mitchell. She helped push the big lie and join the twice impeached, disgraced, and now indicted ex-president on the phone call in which he pressured Georgia officials like Brad Raffensperger to reverse Trump's election loss there. The Post reports that although it's unclear how precisely Mitchell stuck to the prepared slides, quote, the presentation, which had more than 50 slides and was labeled a level playing field for 24, offered a window into a strategy that seems designed to reduce voter access and turnout among certain groups, including students and those who vote by mail, both of which tend to skew Democratic. The Post adds that it listened to portions of what Mitchell did say at the donor retreat through recordings obtained by liberal activist Lauren Windsor. And while NBC News has not verified the clips of what Windsor herself posted, here's just a sample where Mitchell discussed limiting campus voting.
What are these college campus locations in polling? What is this young people effort that they do? They basically put the polling place next to the student dorm, so they just had to roll out of bed, vote, and go back to bed.
Just think about that for a minute. They're pulling the alarm on the fact that college students can, as Cleta Mitchell said, roll out of bed, put on their clothes, and vote. What's wrong with that? Not that they're voting, just that they're not voting for you, right? Washington Post reports that Cleta Mitchell didn't respond to the request for comment. She also didn't respond to requests from NBC News. Voting rights attorney, founder of the site Democracy Docket, Mark Elias, joins us right now. It's nuts. It's nuts when they say it all out loud and put it in writing. But I guess that's why we needed federal voting rights legislation 2 years ago, something that I know we agree on. What do we do now? What is the today strategy for an out loud and stated plan to make sure that college students can't get out of bed, put on their clothes, and go vote?
Right. So two things. First is we need to acknowledge how outrageous it is. We have been experiencing now, under Donald Trump, starting in 2017 to the present, a normalizing of what is outrageous behavior. And this is just the latest example of it. I mean, here it is, one of the most prominent Republican lawyers talking at the Republican National Committee about how they can go about preventing college students from voting. You know, Republicans are big talking about the Constitution and the amendments and how we have to abide by the amendments, whatever the outcome may be. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in the 1970s precisely to ensure the right of young voters to vote and to not have their votes suppressed or their right to vote abridged. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to acknowledge that we are not going to out-organize voter suppression. The other side is arming through state legislatures, through private actors, through litigation. They are arming the right to deny wholesale the right to vote of Black, brown, and young voters. She's focusing here on young voters. And our side needs to recognize that this is not an organizing problem. This is not a messaging problem. This is a fundamental attack on voting rights, and we need to treat it as the five-alarm fire that it is.
Mark, you've said a lot of profound things on the show. I just wrote this down. We are not going to out-organize voter suppression. I feel like that was the point of Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game out of Georgia when they passed a voter suppression law. But to your point, everything went back to business as usual. There was no boycott. I mean, what is the... I agree with you on the substance. I agree with you on the appropriate response. But how do you get everybody else to sort of come when you pull the alarm?
I don't know. That's the great mystery, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, we are watching democracy be dismantled and attacked on all fronts, whether it is what we see that Donald Trump did with the records in Mar-a-Lago, what you were just talking about the Supreme Court and this absolutely outrageous decision out of a district court in Texas that the Fifth Circuit, by the way, the Fifth Circuit, every time I litigate in the Fifth Circuit, they tell me that my voters don't have standing. How the hell these doctors had standing just goes to show the hypocrisy of it all. But to your point, like, all I can do is scream at the top of my lungs that we need to all do everything we can every single day to combat the assaults on democracy and voter suppression and undermining voting rights. And that's all I can do. And, I talk to you about it, and I know it's all you can do.
Listen, I also think that there's this false sense of relief that some Democrats and democracy loyal Republicans felt after the midterms. Yes, voters had democracy on their mind, but three things were happening. You were screaming from the rooftops. Liz Cheney and Benny Thompson, the 1-6 Select Committee was broadcasting through the tales of Trump-loving Republicans, precisely how he sought to destroy democracy all through the summer leading up to the midterms. And to your point, these things are happening all the time. And I wonder how you think we sustain a national conversation about voter suppression and democracy ahead of the next election. If we could figure it out here, you've got a lot of followers and fans here, maybe it would catch fire.
Yeah, so two other things were going on in the midterms that we just can't paper over. The first is we brought a lot of litigation and won. Reverend Warnock in his victory speech in that Senate runoff acknowledged that the state of Georgia tried to prevent there from being Saturday voting on the Saturday after Thanksgiving.
That's right.
We went to court, we sued, and as a result, tens of thousands of Georgians, the majority of whom were black, were able to vote. So, let's not underestimate the role that played. But the second thing is, though, turnout among Black voters, for example, was not as robust in the midterms as it had been before. So voter suppression is working. The fact that crazy election deniers didn't win doesn't mean that the voter suppression doesn't take a toll. So as we go into 2024 and we see the Republicans and conservatives go into overdrive, like you're seeing with Cleta Mitchell here, it is important that we continue to see the leaders of the pro-voting rights and the pro-democracy movement continue to hammer the importance of this. President Biden played an important role in doing that in 2020 and in 2022, and I'm sure he'll do so again in 2024. But everyone needs to be lifting this message up. Everyone needs to be saying it's not okay. And people who have the wherewithal to bring litigation need to do that. People who have the wherewithal, like you do, to have big megaphones and call them out need to do that. The role of the January 6th Commission was critically important. How the media covers the trials that we are going to see that Donald Trump is involved is really important, because those are fundamentally democracy litigation by another form.
Nicolle Wallace, you always give me something that I write down and curl up into a little thing and put on my wall and hang on to. We are not going to out-organize voter suppression. We'll be part of that. Thank you very much. To be continued, my friend.
Thank you.
When we come back, it may be the why, for why Republicans are trying to suppress the vote of young people. Images just like this one from Florida, where students staged a walkout to protest what they're calling the right-wing takeover of public schools and education. That story's next. Today, students in Florida making their voices heard, walking out of school to protest the expansion of that state's Don't Say Gay bill all the way through 12th grade. It comes as state governments have been ramping up their brutal assault on the rights to exist among the LGBTQ community. Some of the most hostile have been towards transgender individuals and students. This year, 14 states have passed laws aimed at placing restrictions on the trans community. including sports bans, bans against gender-affirming health care, and laws requiring students to use the bathroom that corresponds to the gender they were assigned at birth. One trans lawmaker in Montana, State Representative Zoe Zephyr, has been silenced by her own colleagues for refusing to apologize after warning fellow legislators that if they pushed through anti-trans legislation, kids would die.
If you are forcing a trans child to go through puberty when they are trans, that is tantamount to torture. And this body should be ashamed. If you vote yes on this bill and yes on these amendments, I hope the next time there's an invocation, when you bow your heads in prayer, you see the blood on your hands.
For telling the truth, she has been deliberately misgendered by her own colleagues and prevented from speaking on any bill by the House Speaker until she apologizes. Joining us, Eddie Glaude, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, and Tim Miller, writer-at-large for The Bulwark. Eddie and Tim are both MSNBC contributors. This is a conversation, Tim, we started with Chasten Buttigieg earlier this week about the dehumanization that is necessary for these political attacks to work. And I want to deal with that part of it. Chasten sat here and said, look, I'm not trans, but I'm willing to listen. And I'm not interested in putting myself in the middle of a trans family's medical decisions and their doctor. Why is the GOP?
Why is the GOP? That's a big question for a Friday, Nicolle. I think they see this as a political winner. I just think that it's as simple as that. There are, you saw this in the Virginia governor's race, really is the first example of this, where they thought that the Republicans thought they could get some ground here because they thought the parents are unhappy or concerned or nervous or just scared or anxious about what's happened in kids' schools, right? And that's natural. But I think that then Republicans have taken that and distorted it and said, oh, okay, now we can drive this wedge. We can fearmonger about teachers indoctrinating your children to become trans. And it's the same playbook that goes back to the gay teacher scares in California, in the 1960s and 70s, right? And in Florida and all across the country, right? It's the same playbook that's been going on for 70 years, but I think the Republicans thought they had lost this fight, but saw this opening on trans issues, and they saw the opening when it came to younger kids, and then slowly but surely it's expanded. And this is what we're seeing with Don't Say Gay in Florida. It started K-3, now we're going K-12. It started with just trans bathrooms, then it's trans sports teams, then it's teachers can't talk to students who are trans at all about their gender identity, without getting a parental notification. And a lot of times, you hear from a lot of gay and trans kids in the most vulnerable places, the red parts of these states, of states like Florida, like teachers a lot of times are the person they can confide in, the adult they can confide in, right? Because for whatever reason, their parents at home might not be as welcoming, they might not be ready for it, and the really bad cases might be actively hostile to their self-discovery, right? And so I think that what has happened here is that it's gotten more and more pernicious as Republicans have felt like it's more and more politically, more and more of a political winner. That, as usual with Republicans, what ends up happening is you get these far oversteps, and that's what we're seeing in Florida with the K-12 bill in particular.
Tim, listen, I don't pretend to have all the answers or all the wisdom or any expertise at all, but I think anyone with a kid would pray that whatever your kid goes through in their life is treated with kindness, not cruelty. And I would guess, I'm not positive about anything anymore, but I would guess that that's a majority position in this country still, kindness, not cruelty. How do you make the cruelty a political loser?
Well, like I said, I don't think that it's becoming a political winner, right? I mean, I think there's this huge overstep on the Republican side with the cruelty, where people, look, the kids shouldn't have to protest for their rights, okay? Like, kids should be in school learning, about whatever is appropriate for their grade. They shouldn't have to march, but they've been forced to march in Florida, right? So I think that clearly you're seeing this backlash. But I think that Republicans see, particularly in certain areas, some parents, some opportunity to say, hey, to try to paint this not as cruelty, paint it as, oh, these teachers are indoctrinating your kids and we need to have more control over the teachers. But the problem with that always from the start is it's like, whose rights are we talking about? Whose parents' rights are we talking about? When Republicans talk about parents' rights, it's only the rights of white Christian parents that don't want their kids to learn about, the existence of gays at all, the existence of my family at all, right? We took my daughter to a new school yesterday to go tour it, and I was thinking about the Florida bill. We walked into the classroom, it was me and my husband, right? And you walk out of the classroom, and if you know any 5 or 6 year olds, some of those 5 and 6 year olds said to their teacher afterwards, she has two. What's the deal with that? 2 dads, or is that her? Are those her parents? And any good teacher, just moves on and says to the kids, "Oh yeah, she has 2 dads. I only had 1 mom. Some people have a mom and a dad, right? It's the old Mrs. Doubtfire speech, right? Anyone should do this." That Republicans are trying to, make that into something nefarious and to scare people about that is over the long term certainly going to be a loser. I think that they're preying on some parents' anxieties and fears, about the changing mores on these issues in the short term for short-term benefit in certain parts of the country.
Eddie, over the last, I think, 4 weeks, we've seen kids marching for gun safety. We've seen them marching against these discriminatory bills in Florida. We've seen them marching on behalf of their fellow students, victims of gun violence. The kids are not all right, but they are utterly perfect. Are you seeing something in the kids just basically saying, WTF, America?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have a generation of young people who have come of age in the midst of cascading crises. One could call them or describe them as the catastrophic generation. And they have concluded, I think, at least the students I teach, the students I see, that in so many ways our way of life is broken, a language I've used on this show before. And that conclusion opens up space, right, for them to imagine a different kind of world and a world that they could fight for. It also opens up space for them to long for order. So it's no guarantee that young people are going to reach for a kind of more progressive politics, but they do know that our current system is broken. And so they're reaching for languages, reaching for ways to fight for the world that they want. And so we saw it in Wisconsin. I mean, young college voters off the charts. We saw it in Tennessee, we saw it in Kansas City, now we're seeing it in Florida. So I think it's a substantive judgment about our society, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, the last story I covered is connected to this story, right? Cleta Mitchell's slideshow saying, what's going on? I mean, there's something broken here. College kids, I mean, they can just wake up in their dorms, get dressed, and go vote. We have to fix that. I just got a cue that said we have to sneak in a break and then more Eddie, and it was so perfect. I'm just going to say we have to sneak in a break and then more Eddie. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Tom Llamas, and for me, the news is so much more than a headline. It informs, it inspires, and it still matters. To cover it, you have to be in it. We'll take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. In primetime and streaming live, it's your news playlist. Join me for Top Story, weeknights at 7 Eastern on NBC News Now.
Eddie and Tim are back. Eddie, say more about your students and what we've seen young people take to the streets to try to get our attention, I think, to desperately try to get our attention to say, this is not okay. This is not the country we want to live in.
Right. Right. I mean, these are the students who've grown up and going to school and having shooter drills. These are the students who student loan debt has surpassed all other kinds of debt. These are the students who feel like we have handed them a world that's fundamentally shattered in some ways. So they are holding us to account, and they're fighting, I think. They're going to fight vigorously for it. But I think what's interesting is that what we're seeing, Nicolle, really quickly is this bifurcation. For Republicans, they have 2 views: liberty for them, authority for the rest of us. Freedom for them, authority for the rest of us. That's what was at the bottom of Tim's question. Whose parents' rights, right? Liberty for them, authority for the rest of us. How do we undermine the cruelty as the underlying proposition? We have to fight robustly, right, for a world that shatters the selfishness that makes the cruelty possible. Does that make sense?
Totally, and I think
I'm stuck on that question.
No, I think you know my mission for 2 hours is to try to find evidence of which way we're going. Right? I ask people all the time, who's winning? There's a little bit of evidence that in some of the school board races around the country, we focused a lot of coverage around them, around COVID, around here. We met some people that some sort of unlikely heroes, and I want to read you something, Tim, from Politico that goes a little bit of distance toward answering Eddie's question. Politico reports this. Democrats and teachers' unions boasted candidates they backed in Midwestern suburbs trounced their opponents in the once sleepy races. The winning record, they said, was particularly noticeable in elections where conservative candidates emphasized agendas packed with race, gender identity, and parental involvement in classrooms. So, it's Friday. It's 5:51. We're waiting for the Supreme Court. I am cautious about being optimistic under these circumstances. But it seems like, again, when you make the choice stark, I don't have all the answers, but I know if I have to choose between something cruel and something kind that I may not totally, understand individually, most people hopefully will choose the kinder route. Do you think some of these electoral results can let us say that most people will reject cruelty?
What? I hope so. That's a good spin on it. I'll put it this way as an old political operative. I think you got to fight, though. You got to fight for it, right? You got to make your case.
Absolutely.
And I think that the Democrats were on their heels, particularly around COVID in these school fights, right? Because I think that there was a coalition of parents, rightly or wrongly, that wanted more opening in schools, et cetera, et cetera.
Then a coalition, every parent, let me just, right. Even if you understood why they were home.
Wanted their kids in school.
Right. Every parent knew they were inadequate as teachers.
Exactly. So they wanted more school, whether that was the teachers' union's fault or whatever. That's for a show where we have more time, right? But the Republicans were on offense then. Here's what's happened though in the meantime, is that Republicans have tried to press that advantage to do a lot of insane stuff with these school boards, and all of a sudden it's like you want the person with the MAGA hat screaming at a school board meeting deciding the curriculum for your kid, or do you want your teachers deciding the curriculum? I think that there is a similarly large coalition of people that have decided we want the teachers deciding the curriculum, not the MAGA activist parents. But you've got to argue for that. You've got to turn people out to these school board elections. You've got to engage. And I think that Democrats have started to do that.
Eddie, the teacher in the school thing is so interesting. It's another one where Republicans need voters to hate the teachers' unions, but most people love their kids' teachers. And so they need you to hate what you can't see. And it's discordant with the experience in most people's lives.
Absolutely. How many of us can point to that teacher that's put something in us that laid the pathway for us to become who we are? Right. And so even though you have Republicans trying to demonize teachers, we know that every child, every parent knows that some teacher's putting a crown above their child's head. And so we want to celebrate them, even though we might have some differences with unions or however we want to describe it. But I want to say that at the heart of this, everyday ordinary people on the ground, if we're going to fight, we're going to have to put aside Republican, Democrat. We're just going to have to fight for decency, fight for right, and fight against cruelty, period.
I think that's right. I'll march with you on that. Hey, Claude, Tim Miller, thank you so much for being here on a Friday. Thank you very much for this conversation. Another break for us. We'll be right back. One last thing today, and it's a big one, a tease for next week. NBC News has learned that is when President Joe Biden is preparing to make his bid for re-election official. A 2024 video announcement, sources say, could come as soon as Tuesday. President Biden has teased for months that he will make his re-election campaign official at some point, but NBC News has learned that White House advisors and campaign staffers have been sent signals in recent days to, quote, get ready. The timing is likely anything but a coincidence. Next week is the 4-year anniversary of President Biden's 2020 campaign launch. Another break for us. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for letting us into your homes for another week of shows. We are so grateful.
Hey, everybody, it's Hoda Kotb and Jenna Bush Hager. And we got big news, y'all. Our show is now a podcast.
That's right. You can take us anywhere you go, in your car, to the gym, even just at home on your own couch with a glass of wine.
We like spending time with each other, and now we love that we can spend even more time with you. Are you sick of us yet?
Yeah, don't be, because you can never have to miss a moment of fun, laughs, or friendship.
Yeah, subscribe. Listen to Today with Hoda and Jenna wherever you get your podcasts.